20 months after I buried my husband, my phone rang at 3 in the morning. I did not recognize the number. I almost did not answer. At 3 in the morning, alone in a house I had only lived in for 8 months, my first instinct was to let it go to voicemail and deal with it in daylight when things have less weight. I answered on the fourth ring. A man's voice. Low, unhurried, slightly careful in the way of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. He said one word. One word that Thomas and I had invented together 30 years ago. A word that meant nothing in any language, that had no definition outside of our marriage, that we had agreed would mean only one thing if either of us ever said it to the other. I am in danger. Come now. Tell no one. A word we had never once used in 38 years of marriage. A word that Thomas had taken to his grave. Or should have. The line went dead before I could speak. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old and I live in Connecticut. Thomas was my husband for 38 years. He died 20 months ago, officially, on a Tuesday morning in February. In the time since, I have discovered more about the life we shared than I ever expected to know. I believed, by the time that phone rang, that I had found the bottom of it. One word at 3 in the morning told me I had not. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and leave me a comment below. Tell me what city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. Now let me tell you about the word. The word was invented on a Tuesday evening in October of 1994. I remember the specific evening because Lucas was 6 years old and had just started first grade and was going through a phase of elaborate nighttime fears that required negotiation and patience, and occasionally a glass of warm milk that he didn't actually want, but found procedurally comforting. Thomas and I had gotten him back to sleep and had come downstairs and sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and the particular exhausted tenderness of parents who have spent 30 minutes talking a child through an imaginary threat and are now quietly grateful for each other. Thomas had been following a case in the news. A woman in another state who had tried to signal for help in a public situation and had not been able to because her husband was present and watching, and she had no way to communicate distress without escalating the danger. Thomas found this particular kind of helplessness, the inability to ask for rescue when rescue was needed, more troubling than almost anything else he encountered. He had a professional relationship with situations where people needed help and couldn't ask for it. It informed the way he thought about safety. He said, "We should have a word." I asked him what he meant. He said, "A word that means only one thing between us. Not a word from any language. Something invented. Something that if you heard it from me or I heard it from you, in any context, at any time, meant one specific thing and required one specific response." I asked what the one specific thing was. He said, "I am not safe. Come. Tell no one else." We sat at the kitchen table and invented a word together. It took perhaps 20 minutes. We wanted something pronounceable but meaningless, something that could be said casually in a sentence without drawing attention, something that would not be confused with any word in English or in any language Thomas knew. He was particular about this. He tested several combinations before one satisfied him. The word we settled on was Belther. We said it to each other a few times to make sure we could reproduce it reliably. Lucas came downstairs for water midway through, and we stopped talking until he was back upstairs. Even then, even in the first hour of its existence, we treated the word as something that required privacy. We never told anyone. Not Lucas when he was older. Not our closest friends. Not in any moment of intimacy or wine-loosened confidence over 3 decades. The word existed only between us, in that kitchen in October of 1994, and we carried it separately for 28 years without ever needing it. After Thomas died, I thought about the word occasionally. Not often. It surfaced sometimes in the particular way that private shared things surface after a person is gone, as a small specific grief, the grief of a thing that will now never be used. That exists only in one person's memory and will disappear entirely when that person is no longer here to remember it. I had not thought about it in several months. I had not thought about it until the moment a man's voice said it at 3 in the morning and the line went dead. And I understood, in the particular instant of hearing it, that the word being spoken meant either that Thomas had told someone something he had sworn never to tell, or that Thomas was not as dead as I had believed. I did not sleep after the call. I sat in the kitchen with the lights on and my phone on the table in front of me, and I went through every possible explanation in the order of their plausibility. The most plausible explanation was that someone had found the word. Not invented it independently. The probability of that was so close to zero as to be mathematically unserious. But found it. Perhaps Thomas had written it down somewhere, in the journal that Miriam had delivered, or in a document I had not yet located, or in some communication with one of the people in his hidden life who had chosen to use it now for reasons I could not yet understand. I reviewed the journal in my memory. I had read it twice, carefully, every entry across 30 years. I had not seen the word. I was confident of this, because the word was the kind of thing I would have noticed immediately. It was specific and strange enough that it could not have been registered as anything other than what it was. The second explanation was that Thomas had told someone. That in one of the relationships I knew about, or in one I did not yet know about, he had at some point disclosed the word, perhaps as a form of intimacy, perhaps as evidence of trust. Perhaps in a moment of vulnerability that had led him to share something he had kept private for decades. This explanation was disturbing but finite. It meant someone knew the word and had chosen to use it. It did not mean Thomas was alive. The third explanation was the one I had not allowed myself to think past yet. I made coffee. I drank it. I watched the clock move from 3:40 to 4:15 to 5. At 6, I called Patricia. She answered on the third ring with the alert quality of a woman who is used to calls at unusual hours from a client who occasionally has reason to make them. I told her about the call. I told her about the word. I told her everything about the word, its origin, its meaning, the fact that no one outside of Thomas and me had ever known it existed. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need the number." I gave it to her. She said she would have Sandra trace it immediately and call me back within the hour. I sat in the kitchen and waited. Sandra called back in 40 minutes. The number was a prepaid mobile phone purchased with cash at a convenience store in Providence, Rhode Island, 11 days earlier. No registration. No identifying information. The phone had made exactly 2 calls in its operational life. The one to me at 3 in the morning. And one earlier the same day, a 12-second call to a number Sandra was still working to identify. Providence. Ruth Calloway lived in Providence. I called Ruth before I had fully decided to call her. She answered immediately, which told me she had been awake. I asked her directly if she had any involvement with a prepaid phone purchased in Providence 11 days ago. She said no. She said it simply and without the particular quality of carefulness that a person who is lying introduces when they say no to something they have done. I believed her. I asked her if she was all right. A pause. She said, "Someone knocked on my door last night. Late. I didn't open it. I looked through the window and there was a man on my porch who I didn't recognize. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes and then walked away. I didn't sleep after. I told her to call Agent Torres immediately. I told her not to open her door for anyone she didn't know. Then I called Patricia back and told her about Ruth's visitor. The investigation that followed moved with the particular focused urgency of a team that has been working a case for 20 months and has suddenly acquired a new thread that connects to everything they have built and changes the tension on all of it simultaneously. The phone rang again at 9 the following morning. The same number. I answered on the first ring. The same man's voice. Slightly less rehearsed than the night before, which I read as either fatigue or relief that I had answered again. He said, "I know you don't know who I am. I know you have no reason to trust me. I know what I said last night is either the most frightening thing you've heard in 20 months or the most confusing. I need you to give me 10 minutes before you do whatever you're going to do." I had Agent Torres on a second phone and Patricia on a third, both listening. I said, "Tell me how you know that word." A long pause. He said, "Thomas told me." I said, "Thomas told you a word he invented privately with his wife and told no one for 28 years. He said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because he needed someone to use it if he couldn't." He needed someone who would know to call you if things went wrong on his end, and he was no longer in a position to call you himself. I held the phone very still. I said, "What do you mean by no longer in a position?" He said, he thought Lindsay might try to stop him before he could get to Lisbon. He thought if she found out about the plans she might. He said she was unstable. He said she had access to things that frightened him. He gave me the word as a failsafe. He said if I ever called you and said it, you would know the situation had become dangerous and that someone needed to tell you the full truth before certain people could use his disappearance to complete what he had started. I thought about Lindsay, about the compound in Thomas's body, about the investigators' conclusion that she had poisoned him before he could reach the airport. Thomas had been right to be frightened of Lindsay. He simply hadn't been frightened early enough. I said, "Who are you?" He said his name was Marcus Webb. He said he was 58 years old. He said he had known Thomas for 11 years. He said, not in the way the others knew him. Not as a partner or a wife or a woman he was building something with. I was his exit. I was the person who was supposed to make the Lisbon plan work logistically. I handled certain arrangements, documents, transportation. The kind of things a man who wants to disappear needs to have handled by someone who knows how to handle them. I said, "You helped him plan to abandon his wife." A pause. He said, "I helped him plan to disappear." I didn't know the full shape of what I was helping him disappear from until much later. When I understood it better, I had already been involved for long enough that stopping didn't seem available to me. I said, "And yet here you are." He said, "Here I am." I said, "Why now?" 20 months. He said, "I've been watching from a distance. I knew about the investigations. I knew about the convictions. I knew about what you found in the storage unit. I knew because Thomas had told me enough that certain pieces of what became public matched what I already knew privately, and I could track what was happening without being directly involved." I said, "And you said nothing." He said, "I said nothing because I was afraid." That's the honest answer. I was afraid of what I had been part of and afraid of what coming forward would mean for me. I said, "So what changed?" He said, "Someone came to see me last week. A man I don't know. He asked questions about Thomas that he shouldn't have been able to ask, questions that suggested he knew about my involvement and was prepared to use what he knew in ways that weren't going to benefit me." I said, "Who sent him?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Based on what he asked and how he asked it, I believe he came from someone who has an interest in complicating the picture of what happened to Thomas. Someone who benefits from there being more questions than answers." I thought about Lindsay's second trial, about the additional charges, about the 14 extra years and the legal strategies her defense had deployed and the people who had been willing to act on her behalf. I said, "Tell me everything." He said, "I need a guarantee first." I said, "You called me with an emergency code at 3 in the morning and then asked for a guarantee." A very brief pause. He said, "Fair enough. I'll talk to your attorney." On the third phone, Patricia was already writing. On the second phone, I could hear Agent Torres moving. I sat at my kitchen table with 3 phones and 20 months of carefully reconstructed understanding and felt the floor shift again. Not from under me. I had become, over 20 months, a woman who could feel the floor shift and remain standing. Marcus Webb came to Patricia's office 4 days later. In the intervening days, Agent Torres had run a preliminary background check. Marcus Webb existed in the way that people who handle arrangements for other people exist, present in the public record in ways that were unremarkable individually and slightly more interesting in aggregate. A logistics consultant. A prior address in 3 different states over 12 years. A professional history that was real but thin, the kind of thinness that suggested a man who had learned to be not quite findable without being actively hidden. He was 58 years old, as he had said. Gray-haired, medium height, the kind of ordinary appearance that is itself a professional asset when your work requires you to move through situations without being noticed. He sat across the conference table from Patricia and me and Agent Torres, and he put his hands flat on the table and said, "I understand what I'm walking into, and I'm walking it anyway." Patricia had arranged a cooperation agreement in principle, conditional on the value of what he provided. Not immunity, that was not available given what was already known, but consideration. The kind of consideration that acknowledges the difference between a man who comes forward voluntarily and one who has to be found. He talked for 3 hours. The picture that emerged was this. Marcus Webb had met Thomas 11 years ago through a professional contact in the financial industry, not Gerald Whitmore, someone else. A man who operated in the space between legitimate financial services and the kind of arrangements that legitimate financial services do not officially offer. Thomas had been looking for someone who could manage the logistical architecture of a disappearance. Not immediately. He was planning well in advance, with the characteristic patience of a man who had learned through his legal career that the cases which failed were the ones built in haste. Marcus had arranged false documentation before. He was careful about this in his testimony. He said it without elaboration, and Patricia did not press on it because pressing on it was not what this meeting was for. Over 11 years, Marcus had helped Thomas construct the infrastructure of Daniel Mercer. Not the financial fraud, that was Gerald Whitmore's domain, and Marcus said he had known about it in outline but not in detail. His work was identity. The passport. The background documents. The digital footprint that made Daniel Mercer a person who could board a plane and enter a country and rent an apartment and not trigger the searches that would be run when Thomas Allen Brooks was reported missing. I asked him at what point Thomas had given him the word. He said, about 18 months before Thomas died. He called me and said he was worried about Lindsay. Not in general terms. He said he had told her too much. That she had been useful in the plan for specific reasons, but that she had become, he used the word unpredictable. He said she had started asking questions about the timeline that suggested her interests and his interests were not as aligned as he had believed. He said Thomas had told him about the word that night. Said it was something only his wife knew. Said that if anything happened to him before Lisbon, if he couldn't make the flight, if the plan collapsed, if Lindsay did what he was beginning to fear she might do, Marcus should call me. Say the word. Let me know that whatever I was going to find, there was a piece I hadn't found yet. I said, what piece? Marcus looked at the table. He said, the money that was supposed to get to you. Patricia leaned forward. He said, the account in your name, the James Eleanor Brooks account, that was one part of it. The visible part. The part Thomas designed to survive legal scrutiny. But there was another part. Older, larger, held differently. Thomas had been building a second provision for years, separate from the named account, in a structure that was designed to be inaccessible to anyone looking for it unless they knew exactly where to look and what name it was under. Agent Torres said, what name? Marcus said, Felther. The room was completely silent. Thomas had named a financial account after the emergency word he had invented with his wife on a Tuesday evening in October of 1994. He had built a provision for me and hidden it inside the word that meant I am not safe. Come now, tell no one. I sat at the conference table and thought about what it meant to love someone and harm them and build their rescue into the same word as their danger. I did not have an answer. I am not sure one exists. I asked Marcus why he had waited 20 months. He said, I told you. Fear. And something else. I kept thinking she's found so much already. The storage unit. The women. The trial. What if she finds this too and I'm just a complication she doesn't need? I said, and then someone came to your door. He said, and then someone came to my door. And I understood that staying silent wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was just protecting me. And that had stopped being sufficient. I looked at Agent Torres. She was already on her phone. The man who had visited Marcus Webb was found within 8 days. His name was Derek Foss, 43 years old. A private investigator based in Massachusetts with a professional history that Agent Torres described as creatively versatile. A phrase that in context meant he had worked cases that operated in the gray areas between legal investigation and the kind of information gathering that requires careful framing to describe to a federal investigator. He had been hired to locate and approach anyone connected to Thomas's hidden life who might have information that could complicate the established narrative of Thomas's death and Lindsay's conviction. The goal, as Agent Torres explained it, was not exoneration. The evidence against Lindsay was too complete for that. The goal was appeal. Specifically, the kind of appeal that introduces enough procedural complexity to reduce a sentence significantly even when the underlying conviction remains. Someone was trying to get Lindsay out early. Or at least earlier. Derek Foss cooperated after 40 minutes with Agent Torres, which Agent Torres said was consistent with a man who had understood from the beginning that his involvement was finite and was not prepared to absorb consequences on behalf of whoever had hired him when those consequences materialized. He had been hired by a woman named Teresa Foss, his sister. Teresa Foss was 41 years old. She had been Lindsay's closest friend since college. She had been present at Lucas and Lindsay's wedding. She had visited Lindsay in prison 4 times in the 18 months since the conviction. She had, according to Derek Foss's account, become increasingly convinced that Lindsay had been manipulated by Thomas into a situation from which she had seen no exit and had decided to do something about it. The something she had decided to do was hire her brother to find people who might provide alternative testimony about Thomas's character and planning, testimony that would support a narrative in which Lindsay was a victim rather than a perpetrator. She had also, Agent Torres said carefully, made contact with Paul Garrett. Paul Garrett, who was serving a 4-year sentence for his role in filing my false death certificate. The connection between Teresa Foss and Paul Garrett was not yet fully established. What was established was that they had communicated through channels that, while not illegal in themselves, suggested a coordinated effort to locate information or people that could be used in Lindsay's appeal process. I asked Agent Torres what this meant legally. She said it meant that Lindsay's appeal, which had been filed 6 weeks earlier and was proceeding through the normal timeline, would now be examined in the context of this additional activity. That the appeal itself was a legal right that could not be prevented. But that the manner in which supporting information had been gathered for it, specifically the approach to Marcus Webb, which had involved implicit pressure, created its own legal questions. She said, the short version is that Lindsay's appeal just became more complicated rather than less. And the people working on her behalf have drawn attention to themselves that they were not expecting. Marcus Webb's cooperation agreement was finalized 2 weeks later. He had been part of Thomas's planning for 11 years. He had helped construct a false identity used in the commission of significant financial fraud. The cooperation agreement did not eliminate consequences, it shaped them. He would serve time. Less time than without the agreement, more time than he had hoped for. Agent Torres said his cooperation had been genuine and complete and had produced information and evidence that materially advanced 2 active investigations. That was, she said, worth something. I did not argue. The Velther account. Patricia located it within 3 weeks of Marcus's testimony, using the name and the jurisdictional information he provided. It was held, as he had described, in a structure that was not immediately visible in the searches that had been run during the initial civil recovery process. Not hidden in a way that was designed to survive forever, Thomas had not built things to survive forever. He had built things to last long enough. Long enough for him to reach Lisbon. Long enough to be transferred once he was established under the Daniel Mercer identity. It had lasted 20 months instead. Patricia told me the amount on a Thursday morning in the way she told me significant numbers now, quietly, directly, with a moment of silence afterward that acknowledged the weight of it without performing anything. The amount was the largest single recovery in 20 months of civil proceedings. Thomas had been building it for a long time. I sat with the number and thought about what it represented. Not the money itself. Money at this point in my life was a practical matter, something to be managed responsibly rather than responded to emotionally. What I thought about was the act of building it. A man who had been systematically removing money from his wife's life and simultaneously setting aside the largest single sum for her use. Both activities sustained over the same years with the same methodical attention. Thomas had named the provision after our emergency word. The word that meant, I am not safe. Come now. Tell no one. He had used the word that meant emergency as the name for the thing he was leaving in case of emergency. I asked Patricia if she thought he had planned it that way. The naming. She said she didn't know. She said Thomas was a man who left things deliberately and also a man who sometimes did things whose full deliberateness we could not assess from the outside. I told her that was the most honest answer she had given me in 20 months. She almost smiled. Lucas called the evening after the recovery was confirmed. He had been told through Patricia's office, which was the appropriate channel for information that had legal and financial dimensions. He called me after he had spoken to Patricia and had had time to sit with the information for an hour. He said, "He named it after your word." I said, "Yes." He said, "The word you invented together." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if that's something or not." I said, "I don't either. I've decided that's all right." A long pause. He said, "Are you okay, Mom?" I said, "Yes. I genuinely am." That was true. I meant it completely. It is April. 21 months since Thomas died. 3 months since a man I had never met called me at 3 in the morning and said a word that no one alive should have known. The garden is fully underway now. Not the tentative beginning of March, the committed, decided spring of mid-April, where the light has made up its mind and the things that were waiting underground have arrived. The tulips I did not plant are in their second season. The ornamental grass I divided last fall has established itself in both new locations with the quiet confidence of something that knows where it is now and intends to stay. Ruth texted yesterday morning from Providence. She said the man who had stood on her porch that night had been identified as connected to Derek Foss's operation. She said knowing that made her feel safer. She said she had started sleeping through the night again. I told her I was glad. Sophie called from Portland last week. She is working on a large urban greenway project, the kind of project that takes years and requires sustained attention and produces something that will outlast everyone involved in making it. She talked about it with the particular contained excitement of a person who has found work that suits them completely. She asked about the garden. I described the tulips. She said, "You sound different." I asked how. She said, "Quieter. Not sad quiet. Settled quiet. Like someone who has stopped bracing for the next thing." I thought about that. I think she is right. Velther. The word Thomas and I invented on a Tuesday evening in October of 1994 when Lucas was 6 years old and frightened of imaginary things and the coffee had gone cold and we were sitting at a kitchen table being quietly grateful for each other. The word that meant emergency. The word that became the name for the largest provision Thomas made for me. The word that a man I had never met said at 3 in the morning 20 months after Thomas died, and that led, through its own particular chain of consequences, to the final recovery of what Thomas had set aside. I have thought many times about what it means that he used it. That he took the word for danger and made it the container for safety. Whether that was intentional or whether it was simply Thomas doing what Thomas did, building things in relation to me even when he was building things that were meant to remain hidden. I have decided that I do not need to know. Some things do not require resolution. They require only acknowledgement, the recognition that they exist, that they are complicated, that the complication is real and does not need to be simplified in order to be survived. Thomas loved me and harmed me and built my rescue into the word for my danger. All of that is true. All of it at the same time. I am 62 years old. A word I invented 30 years ago came back to me at 3 in the morning from a stranger's mouth. I answered the call. I stayed on the line. I found out what it meant. I am still here. The garden is in April. That is the whole story. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever had something from your past find its way back to you when you thought it was gone. Tell me what you did when it did. I read every single one.